The telegram arrived on the morning Thomas Garrett was supposed to marry Caroline Wells, and the words on that thin paper destroyed everything he thought he knew about loyalty and love. Caroline had run off with his younger brother Marcus in the night, eloping somewhere east where nobody would ask questions about betrayal or broken vows. Thomas stood in the dusty street of Fort Smith, Arkansas in 1878, still wearing his wedding shirt with the collar starched stiff, holding that telegram while his mother sobbed on the church steps and the guests dispersed like tumbleweeds in a bitter wind. The wound cut deeper than any bullet could have managed. Marcus was not just his brother, but had been his closest friend since childhood. The boy he had taught to ride and rope. The young man he had defended in every saloon brawl and supported through every failed venture. Caroline had been Thomas's sweetheart for 3 years, a merchant's daughter with honey-colored hair and promises that melted like sugar in summer heat. The double betrayal left Thomas hollowed out, a man going through motions without purpose. He could not even muster anger, just a cold emptiness that settled into his bones and made the world seem colorless. His father, Henry Garrett, owned one of the largest cattle ranches outside Fort Smith, and Thomas threw himself into the work with desperate intensity. He spent 16-hour days in the saddle, checking fence lines and moving cattle, pushing himself until exhaustion offered brief escape from the thoughts that plagued him. The ranch hands learned to leave him alone, recognizing the dangerous quiet that surrounded him like morning fog. Thomas stopped going into town except when necessary, avoiding the pitying looks and whispered conversations that followed him everywhere. 6 months passed in this gray existence. Thomas became harder, more distant, building walls around whatever remained of his heart. He told himself he would never trust anyone again, that love was just a pretty lie people told themselves before reality came crashing through. His mother worried. His father grew frustrated, but Thomas remained locked in his self-imposed isolation, convinced that staying numb was safer than risking more pain. Then Penelope Pierce rode into Fort Smith on an unseasonably warm October afternoon, and everything Thomas thought he understood about keeping his distance began to crack and shift like river ice in spring. She arrived driving a weather-beaten wagon loaded with furniture and belongings, her dark auburn hair tied back in a practical braid, dressed in traveling clothes covered with trail dust. Thomas first saw her when he rode into town for supplies, watching as she struggled to control 2 fractious horses spooked by a barking dog outside the general store. The wagon lurched dangerously, threatening to overturn, and Thomas reacted on instinct rather than thought. He spurred his horse forward and grabbed the nearest horse's bridle, speaking low and calm until both animals settled. Penelope looked down at him, with eyes the color of new leaves, and something in her direct gaze made Thomas feel exposed in a way that had nothing to do with vulnerability and everything to do with being truly seen for the first time in months. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying a musical quality despite the obvious exhaustion etched in her features. "I have been managing them for 3 days now, but I think we are all tired of each other's company." Thomas nodded, keeping his hand on the bridle. "Where are you headed?" "The old Brennan place, about 5 miles west of town. I bought it through correspondence. I'm hoping it is in better condition than these horses suggest everything else in my life is at the moment." The Brennan place had been abandoned for 2 years after old Samuel Brennan died without heirs. Thomas knew the property was run down but had good bones and decent water access. He also knew a woman alone would face considerable challenges getting it operational. "It needs work," he said bluntly. "Probably more than you were expecting." Penelope's smile held no illusions. "Most things do, but I am good with work, and I need a fresh start. Fort Smith seems as good a place as any for that." Something in those words resonated with Thomas, the acknowledgement of needing to escape whatever came before. He found himself offering something he had not extended to anyone in months. "I am Thomas Garrett. My family's ranch is north of your new place. If you need help getting settled, we are neighborly folk. Penelope Pierce, and I would appreciate that more than you know." Thomas helped her get the wagon moving again, then found himself riding alongside her out to the Brennan property, telling himself he was just being helpful. that this was simple courtesy and nothing more. But as they talked during that 5-mile journey, he discovered Penelope had a quick wit and practical intelligence that impressed him despite his determination to remain detached. She had come from Missouri after her father died, leaving her with enough money to buy property, but not enough to stay comfortable in a town filled with painful memories. I needed somewhere I could build something of my own, she explained, as they crossed a creek that marked the boundary of her new land. Somewhere the past does not follow me into every room and conversation. Thomas understood that desire more than she could know. When they reached the property, and he saw her face fall at the sight of the sagging porch and broken windows, he heard himself offering help he had not planned to give. I can send some ranch hands over tomorrow. We will get the roof secured and the windows boarded up proper before the weather turns. After that, it is steady work, but it is manageable. Penelope turned to him with surprise softening her tired features. Why would you do that? You do not even know me? Out here, neighbors help neighbors. That is how things work. The truth was more complicated, though Thomas would not have admitted it even to himself. Something about Penelope's determination and the way she did not flinch from hard reality called to something buried inside him. Some part that wanted to believe purpose still existed beyond mere survival. True to his word, Thomas arrived the next morning with 3 ranch hands and enough lumber to make essential repairs. Penelope worked alongside them, proving herself capable with hammer and saw, never complaining about the physical labor or expecting special treatment. Thomas found himself watching her when he thought she was not looking, noticing the way she approached problems methodically and the quiet satisfaction in her expression when something was completed properly. Over the following weeks, Thomas returned to Penelope's property repeatedly, always finding some reason why his presence was necessary. He helped her fix the well pump, repair the barn door, and reinforce the chicken coop she was building. They fell into an easy working partnership, communicating efficiently about tasks while carefully avoiding anything too personal. Thomas told himself this was just helping a neighbor, nothing that required him to lower his carefully constructed defenses. But Penelope had a way of slipping past those defenses without seeming to try. She never pried into his obvious pain, never pushed for confidences he was not ready to give. Instead, she simply existed in his space with calm acceptance, creating room for him to be himself without judgment or expectation. They talked about practical things mostly, about livestock and weather and the challenges of maintaining property. Yet somehow those conversations felt more honest than anything Thomas had experienced in years. One evening in late November, as they sat on her newly repaired porch watching the sunset paint the Arkansas sky in shades of crimson and gold, Penelope broke through the careful boundary they had maintained. "You do not have to tell me what happened," she said quietly, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. "But I want you to know that I recognize the look of someone who has been hurt badly. I see it in my mirror every morning." Thomas stiffened, his instinct to deflect rising automatically. But something about the fading light and Penelope's gentle honesty made him speak instead. "My fiancée left me for my brother 6 months ago, on what was supposed to be our wedding day. They ran off together, and I have not heard from either of them since." The words felt strange spoken aloud, bringing the betrayal into the open air between them. Penelope was quiet for a long moment, and Thomas braced himself for platitudes or pity. "That is a profound betrayal," she finally said, her voice carrying understanding rather than sympathy. "Not just losing her, but losing him too. Losing your sense of who you could trust." "Yes." The word came out rough, acknowledging more than he had planned. "It made me question everything. Every moment I thought was real, every promise that felt solid. If I could be that wrong about the 2 people closest to me, how can I trust my judgment about anything?" Penelope set down her coffee cup and turned to face him fully. "You cannot let their choices destroy your ability to believe in anything good. That gives them too much power over your life." "Maybe. But it is easier to just not risk it again, easier to keep everyone at a distance and focus on things that make sense, cattle and fences and work that has clear results." "Easier," Penelope agreed, "but lonelier. And it means they win. In a way, They took not just themselves from your life, but your ability to connect with anyone else. Thomas looked at her, really looked, seeing past his own defenses to recognize the wisdom born from her own pain. What happened to you? What are you running from in Missouri? A man I almost married. He seemed perfect on the surface, everything my father approved of and society expected, but beneath that surface he was cruel in small ways that I kept excusing. He controlled what I wore, who I spent time with, how I spoke. When my father died, that man expected me to need him desperately, to marry him immediately out of weakness and dependence. Her voice strengthened with each word. Instead, I sold everything, took my inheritance, and came here. I would rather struggle alone than be comfortable in a cage. The parallel circumstances should have created awkward recognition, but instead Thomas felt something shift inside him, some locked door beginning to open. Penelope understood what betrayal felt like, what it meant to have trust shattered. But unlike him, she had not responded by shutting down entirely. She had chosen difficult freedom over safe imprisonment. "You are braver than I am," he said. "No. I am just scared of different things. You are afraid of being hurt again. I am afraid of never really living at all." Those words stayed with Thomas as he rode home that night, circling through his mind like persistent flies. Was that what he was doing, choosing to exist rather than live because living meant risking pain? The question bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Winter arrived in earnest, and Thomas found reasons to check on Penelope more frequently, telling himself he was just making sure she survived her first Arkansas cold season. He brought her extra firewood, helped her insulate the barn, and showed her the best places to hunt small game. She, in turn, invited him for dinners that were simple but well prepared, and they talked for hours about everything and nothing while snow occasionally dusted the windows. Thomas began to notice small things that cracked his protective numbness further. The way Penelope laughed with her whole body when something genuinely amused her. The concentration in her expression when she was working through a problem. The kindness she showed to the stray dog that appeared on her property, feeding it scraps until it trusted her enough to stay. She was not Caroline, and that realization came as profound relief. Caroline had been pretty and charming, but ultimately shallow, loving the idea of being a rancher's wife more than loving Thomas himself. Penelope was different, made of sterner and more genuine material. One evening in January, Thomas arrived to find Penelope struggling with a broken gate in the freezing cold, her hands red and stiff but still working stubbornly at the frozen metal. He dismounted and moved to help without speaking, their teamwork so practiced now that words were unnecessary. When they finished, Penelope looked up at him with snow dusting her hair like lace, and Thomas felt his heart lurch in his chest with something that was definitely not just neighborly concern. The realization terrified him. He was developing feelings for Penelope Pierce, genuine feelings that went beyond physical attraction or simple companionship. She had somehow slipped past every defense he erected, not through force, but through persistent, gentle presence. And the thought of caring about someone again, of making himself vulnerable to that kind of potential pain, sent panic racing through his veins. He started avoiding her after that night, making excuses about ranch work and winter demands. Penelope did not push, did not show up demanding explanations, but Thomas could feel her absence like missing warmth. He threw himself back into isolated work patterns, trying to convince himself that he was better off alone, that caring about anyone was a risk not worth taking. His mother confronted him after 2 weeks of this self-imposed exile. Sarah Garrett was a small woman, made formidable by raising 3 sons and surviving frontier hardships, and she cornered Thomas in the barn with the determination of someone who had reached her limit. I'm only going to say this once, so listen carefully. You have been half dead since Carolyn and Marcus left, and I have watched you suffer without interfering because I thought you needed time. But these past months, since that Pierce girl arrived, you have been coming back to life. You have been laughing again, talking again, seeming interested in something beyond just working yourself into the ground. And now you are retreating back into that awful emptiness, and I will not stand by and watch it happen. Mother, this is not your concern. You are my son. Your happiness is absolutely my concern. What are you so afraid of?" Thomas set down the bridle he was repairing, his hands shaking with suppressed emotion. "I am afraid of being destroyed again. I am afraid of trusting someone completely and having them choose someone else. I am afraid that if I let myself love Penelope and it ends badly, I will not survive it this time." Sarah moved closer, her expression softening but losing none of its steel. "Caroline was the wrong woman. You loved who you thought she was, not who she actually was. And Marcus was weak and selfish, which you would have seen if you had not been blinded by family loyalty. But Penelope is different. Anyone with eyes can see that. She is strong and honest, and she makes you better. You cannot let fear of what might happen destroy what could be. What if I am wrong again? Then you survive it, like you survived this. But Thomas, what if you are right? What if she is exactly who she seems to be and you throw away something real because you are too scared to take the chance? That is a different kind of loss, one you choose yourself." His mother left him with those words echoing in the barn's emptiness. Thomas sat in the hay-scented darkness, wrestling with competing fears and desires. The thought of opening himself up to potential heartbreak made him feel physically ill. But the thought of never knowing what he and Penelope could be together, of losing her through his own cowardice rather than her choice, felt somehow worse. The next day was Sunday, and Thomas made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. He cleaned himself up properly, put on his good shirt, and rode to Penelope's property with his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. She was in her garden, working on the cold frames she was building for early spring planting. When she saw him approaching, she stood but did not move toward him, waiting with that patient stillness he had come to recognize. Thomas dismounted and walked to her, searching for words adequate to what he needed to say. "I am sorry for disappearing. I got scared." "I know," Penelope said simply. "I scared myself too. I am probably going to be difficult about this. I have a lot of old hurt that makes trusting people hard. I might pull away sometimes or doubt things that should not be doubted. I know that too. I have my own difficulties, my own old hurts that make me flinch at things that seem like control or manipulation, even when they are not meant that way." Thomas took a careful breath, committing before he could retreat. "But I want to try, with you. If you are willing to be patient with me while I figure out how to do this again." Penelope's smile started slow and built to something radiant. "I have been patient this long. I think I can manage some more." He crossed the remaining distance between them and took her cold hands in his, feeling the calluses that matched his own, the strength in her fingers. "I care about you, Penelope, more than I thought I would ever care about anyone again. You make me want to believe that not everyone leaves, that not everyone betrays trust." "I care about you too," she said quietly. "You make me want to believe that not everyone tries to control or diminish me, that partnership can be real instead of just a pretty word for ownership." They stood there, in the winter garden, holding hands like nervous adolescents, and Thomas felt something in his chest that had been frozen for months begin to thaw. It was not instant healing, not a magical cure for betrayal's damage, but it was a beginning, a tentative willingness to try again despite the risks. Their courtship was unlike anything Thomas had experienced with Caroline. Where that relationship had been easy and surface level, full of social events and performative romance, his connection with Penelope was deeper and more challenging. They talked about real things, about their fears and failures and what they wanted from life. They argued sometimes, passionate disagreements about everything from politics to the best way to train horses, but those arguments never felt like battles to win, just explorations of different perspectives. Penelope never asked Thomas to be anything other than himself. When he had bad days where the old hurt resurfaced and he became distant, she gave him space without taking it personally. When she had moments where someone's casual comment triggered memories of being controlled, Thomas learned to step back and let her process without trying to fix anything. They learned each other's wounds and how to touch them gently, with care, rather than pressure. Spring came to Arkansas with explosive color, the land transforming from winter gray to vivid green seemingly overnight. Thomas spent more time at Penelope's property than his own, helping her plant crops and expand her chicken coop and repair the 100 small things that needed attention. But increasingly, they worked side by side simply for the pleasure of each other's company, stealing kisses in the barn and talking for hours on the porch as daylight stretched longer. One evening in April, as they watched thunderstorms build on the horizon, Thomas found himself thinking about the future in ways he had not since the telegram destroyed his first attempt at marriage. He imagined years of evenings like this, of working alongside Penelope and building something real together. The thought no longer terrified him the way it once would have. "I never thanked you properly," he said, watching lightning flicker in distant clouds. "For what?" "For showing me that betrayal does not mean everyone betrays, for being patient while I learned to trust again, for being so completely different from Caroline that I could not even compare you." Penelope leaned against his shoulder, her warmth solid and real. "You did the same for me. You showed me that men can be partners instead of owners, that I do not have to give up pieces of myself to be loved, that my strength is not something to be diminished but celebrated." Thomas turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Marry me, Penelope, not because it is expected or convenient, but because I love you and I want to spend my life with you. Because you taught me that real love does not betray, it builds and supports and makes both people stronger." Her eyes filled with tears that caught the strange storm light. Yes, absolutely yes. They married in June, a small ceremony with just family and close friends in attendance. Thomas's mother cried happy tears, and his father welcomed Penelope with gruff affection. Marcus and Caroline had sent a letter months earlier, full of apologies and justifications, but Thomas had burned it without reading past the first paragraph. Their choices belonged to them, and he had released any claim to understanding or forgiving them. He had moved forward instead, building something better. The wedding was everything the first one was supposed to be, but with genuine emotion replacing empty performance. When Thomas said his vows, he meant every word with a depth that would have been impossible before Penelope. She had not just healed his broken heart, but had helped him build something stronger in its place, something that could not be shattered by betrayal because it was founded on honest recognition of each other's full humanity. They combined their properties, working together to build a thriving ranch that became known throughout the region for quality livestock and fair dealing. Penelope proved to have a gift for breeding horses, developing lines that were both beautiful and reliable. Thomas handled the cattle operation and business negotiations, but every major decision was made together, true partnership in action. Their first child arrived in the spring of 1880, a boy they named Henry after Thomas's father. Thomas discovered that fatherhood transformed him further, giving him purpose beyond himself. He held his son and thought about the kind of man he wanted to be as an example, someone who honored commitments and treated people with integrity. Someone young Henry could respect not just through fear, but through genuine admiration. Penelope was a natural mother, firm but loving, teaching their children independence alongside kindness. She refused to raise sons who would betray or daughters who would accept betrayal, instead instilling values of honesty and self-respect. As their family grew, 2 more children joining Henry over the following years, their home became a place of genuine warmth, where laughter was common and love was demonstrated through daily action rather than just spoken words. Thomas's relationship with his parents deepened as well, especially after his father's health began to fail. Henry Garrett lived long enough to see his grandchildren and to tell Thomas how proud he was of the man his son had become. The old rancher died peacefully in 1885, surrounded by family, and Thomas mourned him properly, while also feeling grateful for the years they had shared and the wisdom passed between them. Marcus and Caroline never returned to Fort Smith. Thomas heard occasional news that they had settled in Louisiana, that their marriage was troubled but persisting. He felt neither satisfaction nor sorrow at this information, just a distant acknowledgement that they were following their own path. Whatever they had taken from him all those years ago, they had ultimately given him something more valuable, the motivation to build a real relationship based on genuine love rather than convenience or illusion. As the years passed and Arkansas transitioned from frontier territory to settled civilization, Thomas and Penelope's ranch thrived. They became respected members of the community, known for their fair treatment of workers and willingness to help neighbors in difficulty. The Garrett name, which Thomas had once associated with shame and betrayal, became synonymous with integrity and honest dealing. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas and Penelope stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching their children play in the yard while the sun set over land they had built together. Thomas put his arm around his wife's shoulders, marveling, as he still did sometimes, at the life they had created from pain and determination. "I was thinking about the day you drove into Fort Smith," he said. "How close I came to not helping you with those horses, to staying locked in my own misery." Penelope smiled, that warm expression he had fallen in love with and never tired of seeing. "I was thinking about how close I came to going to Texas instead, to choosing some other town for my fresh start. How different everything would have been if I'd made that choice." "We were lucky." "We were brave," she corrected gently. "Lucky that we found each other, but brave enough to take the risk of trying. That is what made the difference." Thomas pulled her closer, feeling the solid reality of her presence, the absolute certainty that had replaced the doubt that once consumed him. "You taught me that real love does not betray, that it shows up consistently, works through difficulties, chooses partnership over easy exits. You taught me the difference between what I thought love was and what it actually is." "We taught each other," Penelope said. "You showed me the same things. That real love does not diminish or control, but celebrates and supports. That I could be fully myself and be loved not despite that, but because of it." Their daughter Sarah, named for Thomas's mother, ran up to the porch demanding that her father come push her on the swing they had built in the old oak tree. Thomas laughed and allowed himself to be pulled into the yard, his wife and children surrounding him with noise and energy and unconditional affection. This was real love, he thought. Not the pretty fantasy he had once believed in, but something deeper and more resilient. Love that survived bad days and disagreements, that grew stronger through challenges rather than crumbling at the first difficulty. Later that night, after the children were asleep and the house had settled into peaceful quiet, Thomas and Penelope sat together in the room they had added to the house specifically as a private space for themselves. It was filled with comfortable furniture and books and small mementos from their years together, a physical representation of the life they had built. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if Carolyn had not left?" Penelope asked, tracing patterns on his hand with her fingers. Thomas considered the question seriously, not flinching from it the way he once would have. "I think I would have been miserable, probably. I would have married the wrong person for the wrong reasons, and we both would have suffered for it." In some strange way, her leaving was the kindest thing she could have done, even if it did not feel that way at the time. "I feel the same about my almost marriage. If my father had not died, if I had not been forced to confront what my life would actually look like with that man, I might have gone through with it. I might have spent years trying to make something work that was fundamentally broken." "We needed to be broken first," Thomas said slowly, working through the realization as he spoke it. "We needed to understand what betrayal felt like, so we could recognize and appreciate loyalty. We needed to experience the wrong kind of love so we could build the right kind together." Penelope nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I do not think we could have had what we have now without those earlier experiences. They taught us what to value and what to never accept again." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of quiet that only comes between people who have learned to communicate beyond words. Thomas thought about the young man he had been on that terrible morning when the telegram arrived, so certain his life was ending, unable to imagine any future beyond pain. If he could speak to that younger self, He would want to say that survival was possible, that something better existed on the other side of betrayal. But he also knew that younger Thomas would not have believed him, that some lessons can only be learned through living them. The ranch continued to prosper as the 1880s progressed. Thomas and Penelope expanded their operations carefully, never overextending but always looking for opportunities to improve and grow. They hired workers fairly, treating them with respect that earned fierce loyalty in return. The Garrett Ranch became known as a good place to work, where hands were treated as valuable people rather than disposable labor. Their children grew into capable young people who understood both hard work and genuine affection. Henry, their eldest, showed early talent for handling livestock and spent hours learning everything his parents could teach him about ranching. Sarah proved to have her mother's intelligence and her father's determination, already reading advanced books at an age when many children were still mastering basic literacy. Their youngest, Michael, was still finding his path, but demonstrated creativity and problem-solving abilities that suggested he would contribute something unique to the family legacy. Thomas made a point of teaching his sons about loyalty and integrity, using his own experience as cautionary tale without bitterness. He wanted them to understand that betrayal left scars but need not define a person's entire life, that healing was possible through honest effort and genuine connection. He taught his daughter that she had inherent worth beyond what any man might offer her, that real partnership meant mutual respect rather than submission. As Fort Smith grew from frontier outpost to established town, Thomas and Penelope watched their community evolve. They participated in church socials and town meetings, helping make decisions about schools and infrastructure. They sponsored families who were struggling, remembering their own difficult beginnings and wanting to extend the kind of help Thomas's family had once provided to others. One afternoon in 1889, 11 years after their wedding, Thomas was working in the barn when a stranger rode up asking for directions. The man was weathered and tired-looking, and something about his posture spoke of hard traveling and harder circumstances. "Looking for the main road east," the stranger said. "Been told Fort Smith is the last decent town before the Indian Territory. Figured I would stock up proper." Thomas provided directions along with recommendations for the best merchant and most honest livery. As the stranger prepared to leave, he paused with obvious internal debate before speaking again. "You would not happen to know anything about Marcus Garrett, would you? I got a letter I'm supposed to deliver, but all I have is an old address that nobody seems to recognize anymore." Thomas felt his stomach tighten at his brother's name. Emotions he thought long buried stirring uncomfortably. "I am his brother, but Marcus has not lived here in over a decade." The stranger looked relieved to be rid of his burden. "Then maybe you could pass this along if you ever hear from him. I was paid to deliver it, and I would like to fulfill the obligation." He handed Thomas a sealed envelope before riding off. Thomas stood holding the letter, debating whether to burn it unread the way he had the last one. But curiosity and something that might have been concern for a brother he once loved won out. He opened it carefully. The letter was brief, written in Carolyn's distinctive handwriting. Marcus had died of fever 6 months earlier in Louisiana. Caroline was alone with 2 young children and no resources, Marcus having spent or lost whatever money they started with. She was not asking for help, the letter made clear, just informing family of his death in case they cared to know. Thomas stood in the barn doorway, letter in hand, trying to process complicated emotions. Grief for the brother he had lost long before death claimed him. Pity for Carolyn, trapped in consequences of her own choices but suffering nonetheless. Relief that this chapter was truly closed now, that no future reconciliation or confrontation would be required. And underneath it all, profound gratitude for the life he had built instead, for the woman who taught him that real love does not betray. He showed the letter to Penelope that evening, needing her perspective to sort through his tangled feelings. She read it carefully before looking up at him with characteristic insight. "What do you want to do?" "I do not know. Part of me feels like I should help Caroline somehow for the sake of my nieces or nephews I've never met. Part of me feels like she made her choices and has to live with them. And part of me just wants to put this behind me completely and never think about any of it again." Penelope took his hand, her touch grounding. "There is no wrong answer here, Thomas. Whatever you decide, I will support you. But I think you need to do whatever lets you sleep peacefully. Whatever choice means you are not carrying unnecessary weight." Thomas thought about it for several days, wrestling with obligation and old hurt and practical reality. Finally, he came to a decision that felt right, even if it was not simple. He sent Caroline money, enough to give her options, but not so much that it created dependence. He included a brief note saying that Marcus had been his brother once, and for that memory's sake, he wanted his niece and nephew to have stability. But he made clear that this was a one-time gesture, closure rather than reconnection. He wished her well and signed it simply with his name. When the bank confirmed the money had been received, Thomas felt something inside him release, some last thread of connection to the past finally severed. He had responded with the integrity that defined him now rather than the bitterness that once consumed him. The choice belonged fully to him, made freely rather than compelled by obligation or revenge. "It is done," he told Penelope that evening. "I did what felt right, and now I can let all of it go completely." She kissed him gently, her approval evident in that simple gesture. "You are a good man, Thomas Garrett, not because of what you did or did not do for Carolyn, but because you thought carefully about what integrity required and followed through. That is what matters." The final decade of the century brought continued prosperity and deepening contentment. Thomas and Penelope's children grew into young adults who made their parents proud through their character rather than just their accomplishments. Henry took over increasing responsibility for the ranch operations, showing the same combination of fairness and business sense that had made his parents successful. Sarah went east for education, something still unusual for young women but increasingly possible, returning with teaching credentials and determination to improve rural Arkansas schools. Michael discovered a talent for mechanics and engineering, fascinated by the new technologies transforming frontier life. Thomas's mother, Sarah, passed peacefully in 1894, surrounded by family and secure in the knowledge that her children and grandchildren were thriving. Her funeral was attended by most of Fort Smith, testimony to the respect she had earned through decades of kindness and integrity. Thomas mourned her properly while also celebrating the wisdom she had shared, particularly that conversation in the barn when she pushed him to risk his heart again. As the new century approached, Thomas found himself reflecting often on the journey that brought him to this place. From the devastation of that telegram morning to the solid happiness of his current life seemed almost miraculous, yet he understood it had not been magic but consistent choice. Choosing to help a stranger with her horses, choosing to risk caring again despite fear, choosing partnership over control, honesty over performance, genuine connection over easy distance. On New Year's Eve 1899, as the 19th century drew to close and the new one waited to begin, Thomas and Penelope hosted a gathering for family and close friends. Their home was filled with noise and laughter, children playing while adults talked about the extraordinary changes they had witnessed and what the future might hold. Indoor plumbing and electricity were coming to Fort Smith. Railroads had transformed travel and commerce, and the wild frontier they had known was rapidly becoming settled civilization. As midnight approached, Thomas pulled Penelope outside to the porch where they had shared so many important conversations. The January air was cold but clear, stars brilliant overhead in the way they only were far from city lights. "I was thinking about making some sort of profound statement about new centuries and new beginnings, just kids," he said, putting his arm around her. "But the truth is, I already had my new beginning the day you drove into town. Everything good in my life comes from that moment and the choice to be brave enough to try again." Penelope leaned into his embrace, her body familiar and dear after more than 20 years together. "We had our new beginning together. And we have built something that will outlast us, something our children will carry forward. That is what real love does. It does not just survive, it creates and expands and touches more lives than just the two people at its center." Inside the house, voices began counting down to midnight. Thomas and Penelope added their voices to the chorus, marking the transition from one century to the next, surrounded by the family and community they had built together. When the new year arrived with cheers and celebration, Thomas kissed his wife with the same passion he had felt as a much younger man, that desire transformed but not diminished by time and familiarity. The first years of the 20th century brought both challenges and triumphs. A drought tested their ranching operation, forcing difficult decisions about livestock and water management. Henry's steady hand and his parents' experience combined to guide them through without devastating losses. Sarah married a teacher she met during her education, a thoughtful man who understood her ambition and supported her work. They settled near Fort Smith, giving Thomas and Penelope the joy of watching their grandchildren grow up nearby. Thomas discovered that being a grandfather brought unexpected pleasure. He could indulge and spoil these young ones in ways he never could his own children, secure in knowing their parents would handle the serious work of discipline and character building. He taught them to ride and rope, passed down stories of Arkansas history, and made sure they understood that their family name meant something worth preserving. Michael left for a while, working with railroad companies and mechanical operations in larger cities, but eventually returned to Fort Smith to open a workshop serving the growing need for machinery repair and innovation. His return pleased Thomas deeply, confirming that what he and Penelope built together was strong enough to call their children home even after they had seen wider possibilities. One evening in 1907, Thomas sat with Penelope watching the sunset from their familiar porch spot. They were both in their 50s now, their hair showing silver and their bodies bearing the marks of hard physical work sustained for decades. But Thomas felt more content than he had at any other point in his life, the satisfaction of a life well lived running deeper than mere happiness. "I have been thinking about writing some of this down," he said. "Our story, I mean. Not for publication or anything grand, just for the grandchildren, so they understand where they come from and what went into building what they will inherit." Penelope considered this, her expression thoughtful. "What would you want them to know most?" "That betrayal is not the end of everything, even though it feels that way in the moment. That real love is different from what people imagine it is, less about romance and more about consistent choice and genuine partnership. That you can survive having your heart broken and build something better than what was destroyed." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "And I would want them to know that their grandmother taught me all of that. That you showed me what real love actually looks like through action rather than words." Penelope's eyes shimmered with emotion. "You taught me just as much. You showed me that men could be trusted. That partnership did not mean losing myself. You proved that strength and gentleness were not opposites but complementary qualities. Everything good in our life we built together." Thomas took her hand, feeling the work-worn calluses that matched his own, the strength in fingers that had literally built their life alongside him. "So that is what I would write. Not just what happened, but what it meant. The lessons we learned and want to pass forward." "Then write it," Penelope said simply. "Tell our story honestly, including the painful parts. Let them see that we were not perfect, that we struggled and failed sometimes and had to learn hard lessons, but we kept choosing each other and choosing integrity, and that made all the difference." Thomas did write their story, working on it during winter evenings when ranch work slowed. He was not a natural writer, his prose plain and straightforward, but he captured the essential truth of their journey. From his devastation at betrayal through their tentative beginning to the solid partnership they had built, he laid it out honestly. He wrote about fear and courage, about hurt and healing, about the difference between the love he thought he wanted and the love that actually sustained him. When he finished and read it aloud to Penelope, she cried at parts she had lived through herself, hearing them from his perspective for the first time. They revised it together, adding her memories and viewpoint, creating something that belonged to both of them rather than just one voice. The document became a treasured family possession, passed between children and eventually grandchildren. Thomas and Penelope's story became foundation myth for their descendants, teaching lessons about integrity and partnership that influenced generations. The Garrett name remained respected in Arkansas not through wealth or power, but through the reputation for fairness and honesty that Thomas and Penelope established and their children maintained. As Thomas and Penelope aged into their 60s and then 70s, they gradually transferred more responsibility to Henry and his growing family. The ranch continued to thrive under younger management, adapting to changing times while maintaining core values. Thomas and Penelope remained active and involved, but with increasing freedom to simply enjoy each other's company and watch their legacy unfold. They traveled some, visiting Sarah and her family when they moved to Little Rock for better educational opportunities. They saw Michael's workshop expand into a significant operation, employing multiple skilled workers. They attended church socials and community events, now elder statesmen of Fort Smith whose presence commanded respect. But mostly they enjoyed the simple pleasure of companionship built over decades. They still sat on their porch most evenings when weather allowed, watching sunsets that never became ordinary. They still talked for hours about everything and nothing. They still reached for each other in the night, their physical relationship transformed by age but no less important for connecting them. Thomas understood in ways his younger self never could have that this was the real victory. Not just surviving betrayal, but building something so solid and genuine that the old hurt became distant history rather than defining wound. Caroline and Marcus belonged to his past, but Penelope was his present and future, the woman who taught him that real love does not betray because it is rooted in daily choice rather than temporary feeling. In 1918, as World War I was ending and the world was transforming yet again, Thomas and Penelope celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary. Their children organized a party that brought together 4 generations of family and friends from throughout the region. Thomas looked around the crowded room and felt overwhelming gratitude for the unlikely path that brought him here. Late in the evening, when the younger folks were dancing and the older guests were sharing stories, Penelope pulled Thomas outside to their porch. The June night was warm and fragrant with honeysuckle, stars scattered overhead like spilled diamonds. 40 years, she said wonderingly. When I drove into Fort Smith that day, tired and scared and determined to make a fresh start, I never imagined this. All of this. She gestured at the house, the land, the celebration continuing inside. Neither did I, Thomas admitted. I was so focused on just surviving each day, so convinced that I would never trust anyone again. And then you appeared, and somehow you made trying again seem possible. We made it possible together. That is what I want people to understand. We did not just fall in love and everything became easy. We chose each other repeatedly through difficulties and doubts and all the regular challenges of building a life. We worked at it every single day. Thomas pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling the solid reality of her body against his. After 40 years, she was still the person he most wanted to talk to share experiences with, to simply be near. That was the truest measure of their success. Real love does not betray, he said quietly, repeating the lesson he had learned so thoroughly. It shows up, it stays, it works through problems instead of running from them. It builds and protects and nurtures. You taught me that, Penelope. You showed me what I thought was love before was just pretty illusion, and you helped me build something real instead. We taught each other, she corrected, as she always did. I learned just as much from you, and we built this together, everything good and lasting that will outlive us both. They stood together in the warm Arkansas night, surrounded by evidence of lives well lived and love honestly earned. Inside, their children and grandchildren celebrated 4 decades of partnership that had created foundation for their own lives. The Garrett Ranch stretched around them, prosperous and well-maintained, legacy of hard work and intelligent management. Fort Smith itself had grown from frontier outpost to thriving town, and Thomas and Penelope had contributed to that growth through community involvement and ethical business practices. But more than any external success, they had built something internal and lasting. They had taken broken hearts and betrayed trust and forged them into genuine partnership. They had learned to communicate honestly, to fight fairly, to support without controlling and challenge without diminishing. They had created a relationship that served as model for their children and inspiration for their community. As they moved into their 70s and 80s, Thomas and Penelope's health began its inevitable decline. Thomas developed arthritis that made ranch work impossible, forcing him to finally fully retire. Penelope's vision weakened, making the detailed work she loved increasingly difficult. But they faced these challenges together with the same partnership that had defined their marriage, neither complaining excessively or expecting the other to solve what could not be fixed. They spent increasing time simply being together, talking about memories and watching their grandchildren grow into adults who carried forward family values. They attended weddings and funerals, christenings and graduations, marking the passage of time through family milestones. The world continued changing rapidly around them, automobiles replacing horses and electricity transforming daily life, but some things remained constant. Thomas died peacefully in 1925, at 71 years old, with Penelope holding his hand and their children surrounding his bed. His last words were to her a simple thank you that encompassed everything they had built together. Penelope mourned him deeply, but without bitterness, understanding that 47 years of genuine partnership was more than most people ever experienced. She lived 3 more years, remaining in the home they had expanded together, cared for by family who refused to let her face old age alone. She spent her time with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, passing down stories and wisdom, making sure the family understood their history and the values that defined them. When Penelope died in 1928 at 73, she was buried next to Thomas in the Fort Smith Cemetery under a simple marker that listed their names and dates and the word partners. Their children made sure the gravestone reflected what their parents had built together, that sense of equal partnership that had defined their relationship. The Garrett ranch continued through subsequent generations, each inheritor adding their own contribution while maintaining core values of integrity and fair dealing. The story Thomas and Penelope wrote together remained treasured family document, read at weddings and important gatherings, teaching new generations about genuine partnership and the difference between easy betrayal and committed love. Fort Smith itself grew and changed, frontier town becoming modern city, but longtime residents still remembered the Garretts and the example they set. Their legacy lived not just in land and buildings, but in the values they modeled and the family they raised. They proved that betrayal need not be final, that broken hearts could heal and build something stronger than what was lost. Thomas's relationship with Caroline and Marcus had taught him what love was not, but Penelope had taught him what love actually was, that daily choice to show up and work together and remain committed even when things were difficult. She had taught him that real love does not betray because it is founded on honest recognition of shared humanity rather than idealized fantasy. And together they had built a life that proved those lessons true across nearly 5 decades of partnership. Their story became the kind that families passed down, shaped and polished through retelling but maintaining essential truth. The tale of a man destroyed by betrayal who found redemption through a woman brave enough to risk her own heart. The story of 2 wounded people who healed together and built something lasting. The proof that real love, the kind that sustains and strengthens, does not betray but remains faithful through all the complicated realities of human existence. And in the Arkansas soil where they were buried side by side, that truth remained constant long after they were gone. Testimony to what they built and what they proved possible through courage and commitment and the daily choice to love honestly.